So for this first project, we're going to practice shading some basic forms and how do you use the Photoshop brushes and tools to do some basic shading. Before we get into the tools, we need to talk a little bit about what exactly shading means. Specifically, how does light interact with 3D objects like spheres, cones, cylinders, and cubes. If you can shade these basic elements, then you can tackle anything. So let's talk a little bit about light. I'll zoom in here and we'll work up at the top. If you've got a light source, we'll say just a single light source, light is going to emit in all directions from that source. It's going to go up, it's going to go out, it's going to go down. Everywhere that it can go, it's going to go. Whenever light emits from it and then strikes a surface, it's going to bounce off of that surface. And depending on how smooth the surface is, light's going to interact differently. The smoother the surface, the more it'll be reflected, or the more it'll reflect in a predictable pattern. And so if I've got a surface that looks something like this, that's a nice and smooth surface. And when I say smooth, I mean smooth on the atomic level. Like if I take a sheet of glass or a sheet of metal and it's very smooth, I can see myself. It's a great mirror. But if I can take a smooth piece of wood, well, it feels smooth, but if I look out on the atomic level, it'll actually look something more like this. There's still ridges and bumps all over the place. So when light strikes a smooth surface, it'll go from the original source, hit it, and then go off in the same angle that it hit. And this is why you can see your reflection really good in a smooth piece of glass or a smooth mirror. That's because you're seeing the exact reflection that it's in. However, if it hits a surface that's not so smooth at the atomic level, it'll go down and it'll go off at one angle, but somewhere else it may go down and do a completely different angle. It'll go back, or it'll go off to this area, so on and so forth. This is called a scattering effect. And this scattering, or this uniform reflection of light, is what gives different objects their material surface. So check out some of these examples. This one on the right obviously looks much like a metallic finish. That's because it's reflecting perfectly the light that's around it. I can see other objects. I can even see the shape of the light source. And when it has a perfect reflection, things become much more metallic looking. And the way you set up your brushes in Photoshop and the way you think about the light will determine what that looks like. However, if it's got a smoother surface, you can see this gets a little bit more smooth, I can still tell that the light source is circular and kind of where it's coming from, but I can't see the reflection of anything else that's around it. This is because on a microscopic level, the surface is much more jagged. This is giving me a much more matte-like finish is what we call it. And you can keep on going till you get an almost paper matte finish where you don't even see a strong highlight. You just have a lighter area and a darker area. But the same rules apply. Wherever light is striking the surface, it's bouncing off. And once it bounces off, it's hitting something else and bouncing off that again. The more it reflects, or we'll give it a more metallic finish. The less it reflects, or the less predictable it reflects, gives it a more matte finish. So the second thing we need to consider, once we know the nature of the light, is where the light placement is and how light forms across different surfaces. So if I look at this particular setup, I can kind of tell that the light is at the top left-hand side. We'll say it's right here. From here, remember, light is going to emit in all different directions. So wherever it goes, there's always going to be some light. And whenever light hits the closest part of the object, that area is going to be the lightest. And this is called the highlight. The highlighted area is always going to be the lightest part of the object. It's actually trying to become the color of the light that's being reflected. So if I've got the cube that's back here, this area is closest to the light, so this area is the highlight. The cylinder, this area is closest, so this area becomes the highlight. And again, as the light travels across this, the form of your object, it's going to get much darker. In the case of the cylinder, it's traveling around and you can see it's getting darker on this edge. In the case of the cube you have, this entire plane is all on the same area, so it all looks smooth. This plane, however, is on a different area and light's not bouncing back towards my eye as much. It's even less on this side. So it gets much darker. The less it bounces off, the more darker or the more shadow it becomes. Speaking of the form of shadows, form shadow tells you what the shape of the object is. And obviously a sphere, it's going to go in a spherical form, moving around this way. So form shadow is one way of telling the shape of an object based on how the lights and darks match the object itself. As it moves around, also light will bounce off the surface. If it's not floating in air, then there should be a surface area. And so if light doesn't strike the surface because it's being obstructed by the edges of the object, it's going to have what's called a cast shadow. The cast shadow is whatever shadow forms along the surface it's sitting on. It's casting it out. And usually it fits whatever shape of the object that you have. You can see this cube back here has a nice angular cast shadow. This one has a nice rectangular, almost cylindrical shadow for that one. Now, as the shadow falls on the form, if it didn't sit on a surface, the farthest edge from the light should be the darkest. However, notice this little sphere. If I was looking at the darker edge, you can see down here at the very bottom, it's actually becoming much lighter. See how right here it's much lighter than it is up here? This is because some of the light is striking the surface, bouncing off of it, and back onto our form. This is called reflected light. And all objects have some sort of reflected light if they're not floating in space. Take a look at our metallic objects. Metallic objects reflect light perfectly, so everything you see is reflected light in some manner. If you look at these, now there is reflected light, but because it's scattering so much, you really can't see it. Actually, you can see it really, really well in this particular setup. Have a look at the sphere here. Notice how it's much lighter right here? That's because the light is coming from the top right. It's hitting the surface and bouncing up, and there's our reflected light. Check out our cube on this side. See how it's much darker here and it's much lighter right here? That's because light is reflecting off of this cylinder or this cone and then onto this area right here. So reflected light, good artists, good painters recognize that if you've got two objects that are really close together, especially if it's the surface, some of that light is going to be shared from the surface onto the object as well. Let's go back to our original. So if I've got reflected light down here, the darkest part of the object, this is called your core shadow. So you can see the core shadow is this area right along in this edge. It's where the highlight is moving around and it's starting to conflict with the dark areas, and it's also meeting up with the reflected light. Even the cast shadow has a core shadow. Usually the area that's closest to the object is going to be the darkest, and as it moves out, it's going to get lighter. Now you can tell this is a lot lighter. Let me erase these away so we can see it, because there's even light reflecting off of this object back down onto the surface. So there's even lighter areas from here. You as an artist need to start training your eye and seeing the lights and darks of all different forms, especially the basic shapes and even the more complex shapes. You can see that it's getting lighter, I think down in this still life. Yeah, there we go. See how it's nice and dark? Let's erase this away. How it's nice and dark on this edge, and as it moves out, it's getting much lighter. This is because the light is starting to penetrate this darker area. So when you do cast shadows, make sure the darkest part of the cast shadow is closest to your object, and that it gets lighter as it moves across. Now that you know the basics of how to set up a still life and think about the light on the still life, your still lifes and any drawing and painting you have will come to life much, much better. Simply understanding the point of the light. Let's draw off a simple 3D form here. Know where the light starts from. Whatever edge is closest, that's going to be the lightest. Whatever edge is farthest away, that's going to be darker. And any other plane is going to be somewhere in between, some middle point. It's going to have a cast shadow on the opposite side of the light, and it usually follows whatever form that you have. That cast shadow is going to be darker as it gets closer to the object and lighter as it moves away. And if there's any surface that it's sitting on, there's going to be some light that'll reflect off the surface onto the darker area. And so this little area will become a little bit lighter from the dark side. Now that we know a little bit about the setup of light, let's jump into our project and see how we can set up our brush tool and our layers to get started.